Hello everyone, and welcome to Christmas Stories on the Vintage Side. Today's story is from the Australian Home Journal magazine of December 1951. This story is called A Little Girl for Christmas. The young Fieldings picked Gertrude Carter, aged 9, out of a hat. The night of the club party, the names of the 6 little homeless girls from the Hermitage were written on slips of paper to be picked out by the tinted, perfumed fingers of the elegant young wives whose husbands were on the committee of the club. Ruth Fielding murmured as she scanned her slip of paper, "Gertrude, poor little thing." "Gertie for short," said Charles, her husband. He handed her another drink, adoring the way she put up her hand to smooth back a lock of hair fallen over her forehead. She raised her glass, eyes sparkling. "Here's hoping we can give Gertie a very happy Christmas." The Geralds wandered over to their table. Sheila looked a little worried. "Ours is called Pauline, and she's 6. We wanted someone older. We're afraid our 2 boys will find her a nuisance." Ruth visualized the 2 Gerald boys, sturdy, high-spirited youngsters with far too many advantages in their lives. A lovely home, indulgent parents, expensive toys. It would do them good, she reflected, to have a little girl visit them. "I only hope she's the bossy kind," she thought mischievously. In the morning, Ruth wondered if they had not been a little too happy-go-lucky in their attitude towards the Christmas guests, drawing them out of a hat. Well, maybe it had been the fairest method, and the easiest. If the matron was to be believed, it meant a great deal to the lucky few to have a real Christmas in a proper home setting. The 6 little girls had struggled constantly to win the number of good behaviour stars which would make them eligible for the joyous reward. Ruth sat up in bed, supported by pillows, remembering the facetious remarks, the light-hearted badinage that had passed between the club members. Charles came into the room with a tray. "Gertrude," murmured Ruth, half-consciously. Charles poured the tea. He was shaved and his hair neatly brushed, and he looked very attractive. "Lord, yes! We must start making proper arrangements for a little girl's Christmas," he said. Ruth remembered back to her own childhood, a tree, the pudding carried to the table in the thrilling majesty of blue and golden flames. There was the port wine in the fat little glasses on slender stems, and the nuts, which tasted so delicious if you cracked them and dropped them into the wine. There was Father, raising his glass across the length of the table to Mother. "My love, dearie." The half-realized truth that between those 2 was held something precious. Charles was still talking, spreading butter on a piece of toast for her. "I suppose we'd better buy a few games for the afternoon, or am I expected to be Father Christmas?" Ruth's heart was stabbed with a vague uneasiness. "You don't mind about all this, do you?" He shrugged. "We couldn't very well have refused, could we? I mean, it would have looked rather churlish." There was the uncaring note in his voice that never failed to chill her. He was sympathetic and generous almost to a fault, but there was invariably a detached indifference towards children. They had been married for 3 years, lovely, happy years. All around them, in this post-war world, they saw marriages tottering, limping along from one year to another, with no real foundation of contentment. When Ruth remarked on this lamentable fact, Charles launched forth with startling ferocity. "All on account of the children. In every case. Take the most outstanding one, the Spurgeons, ready for divorce after only 5 years. It's the children who have spoilt things. Come between a married couple, cause so much discontent." He went on for quite a long time, and his mouth hardened. She objected. "It isn't the children's fault. It's the way they've been managed, or rather mismanaged." In quick review, she recollected her friend's offspring. In most cases, unruly, spoilt, and wearing. Charles put his arms around her. "Look at us, a happy, adoring couple." She agreed with him softly, affectionately, because she loved him, and what he said was so magically the truth. She smothered the vague uneasiness that maybe their mutual happiness in each other was somewhat selfish, restricted. Marriage meant giving, not only to each other, but to children. Now, with the thought of Gertrude uppermost in her mind, she reminded Charles she would be coming on Boxing Day. We all agreed that this was the better day because of the pantomime. He pretended to groan, "Lord, fairies in tights, and a principal boy with a kiddy-widdy charm." She did not smile, her fingers tracing restlessly the pattern on the bed cover. He added quickly, contritely, "I don't mind really, darling. A panto might be fun. I haven't seen one since I was 7. Cinderella," she said happily. "I've booked 3 seats in the front row of the circle, and it's Dick Whittington." It was arranged that Charles should call at the home to collect the little girl in his car around about 10:30 on Boxing Day. Seeing him off, Ruth warned, "Don't be in too much of a hurry to get back. I want to have the presents laid out in the dining room as a welcome." The dining room looked strangely unlike theirs, the tree in the corner giving out its own particular perfume, the paper chains, and the cluster of balloons swaying from the centre light. The telephone rang as Ruth was fastening the zip on her warm red skirt. "It's Sheila Gerald here," screamed a female voice. "My dear, our Pauline has just arrived. I had to tell you. She's sweet! Absolutely adorable. I always did think that it would have made such a difference if our own had been girls instead of 2 boys. Ruth was lukewarm. She couldn't even pretend to like Sheila Gerald. "That's fine. No, our Gertrude hasn't turned up yet." She replaced the receiver and crossed to the window. No sign of the car yet. Suddenly she was nervous. It was a tremendous undertaking to entertain a strange child for a day. She might fit into the pattern of any one of the awful children whom Charles had so frequently deplored. The merry little show-off, the stooge, the incessant questioner, why, what, and where, the pert little know-it-all. Come to think of it, sighed Ruth, it was difficult to visualize any child with the correct amount of everything. Perhaps Charles was right. Children did make holes in the fabric of marriage. When the car arrived, she went to open the front door with an unreasonable sense of foreboding. She would know at once by the expression on Charles's face. He must have jumped out of the car as soon as it stopped because he was already on the doorstep. His face was crinkled with incredulous amusement. "Just look what we've picked," he whispered. Gertrude was standing on the path, clutching a pair of house slippers. She was little and skinny, with pale wispy hair, grey eyes, slightly pink-rimmed. She was plain and vaguely comical. Ruth tried to feel sorry for her. She couldn't. There was a sort of indomitable toughness about Gertrude that ringed her round with a reserved pride. She wasn't the kind of little girl who would be at all grateful for sentimental fussiness. "Well, Gertrude, this is grand!" exclaimed Ruth, extending her hand. "Yes'm, thank you," replied Gertrude, with an automatic politeness that included the sketchiest imitation of a bob. Obviously, she was going to take her time, setting her own pace towards being friendly. With a stilted, unquestioning obedience that Ruth found unnerving, she removed her hat and coat, revealing the drab uniform with white collar worn by all the children at the home. She sat on the stairs to change from walking shoes into elastic-sided slippers. "Now, come and see the tree and unwrap your presents," Ruth invited, holding out her hand. Gertrude had a small, boneless hand, and it lay slack and unresponsive in Ruth's. She stood in the dining room and stared at the tree. "It's very nice," said Gertrude calmly. Charles muttered something that sounded like hell and went along to the kitchen to find something to drink. Ruth gave Gertrude the gaily wrapped parcels and went after him. "I don't know what we've done to deserve this," grumbled Charles. Ruth accepted a glass of sherry. "She's shy, a bit overwhelmed. By this afternoon she'll have become used to us." Charles patted her shoulder. "Don't worry, pet. Once Gertie thaws, I think I shall rather enjoy her," he said cheerfully. Gertrude continued to be a bit putting off for the next few hours. At the dinner table, she behaved with a polite decorum that was slightly exacerbating. At 2:30, the phone rang. Charles went to answer it, looking slightly gaga in a red paper cap. He was away for some minutes. When he returned, he looked at Gertrude in silence and then burst into uncontrollable laughter. "Nice work, kid, nice work," he gasped, slapping the goggle-eyed girl on the shoulder. Ruth demanded, "What's all this about anyway?" Still staring at Gertrude, Charles continued, "The awful doings of Gertrude have at last been discovered." Gertrude drew a quivering breath, and her face turned scarlet. She clapped her hand across her mouth, and her eyes stared back at Charles in alarm. Ruth cracked a nut and controlled her impatience. "Tell," she commanded briefly. Charles was giggling in a quite ridiculous manner. You tell, it's your story. Looking down at her plate, littered with nutshells and crinkly paper wrappings of crystallized fruit, the little girl began in a low, hollow voice. I'm not Gertrude. She has curly hair and even teeth, and everyone fusses over her. She got chosen because she's always chosen. I don't like her. She's soppy. The child's face was pink and scowling, her voice shrill. She was all swank because of coming out for Christmas, so I waited till she went to the lavatory, and then I locked her in. Ruth gasped. She's been there all this time? A smug smile crossed the little girl's face. It's right at the end of the passage on the 3rd floor. She could holler and no one would hear her. Charles laughed. Apparently no one did. If you're not Gertrude, then who are you? He asked. There was a note of kindness in his voice. I'm Jane Stebbing. She made the announcement with quiet pride. My mother was an actress and my father is a sailor. He's somewhere about, but I never see him. I was going to tell you all this, honest I was, but I was afraid you'd be angry. I thought I'd wait until I had some of that wine, so it'd make me a bit tiddly and give me courage. How do you know about being tiddly? Asked Charles, with a lift of his eyebrows. Oh, Uncle Joe, of course. He used to say, when the drink's in, the truth's out, and don't you forget that, my girl. They could visualize the blurry facetiousness in an indulgent old man. So vivid was Gertrude's mimicry. Ruth propped her elbows on the table and regarded the little girl with interest. Uncle Joe? Ruth prompted. Gertrude's voice rose. I lived with him. When he died, I went to the home. Uncle and me had fun together. Sometimes when he came home late, he'd sing to me. He told me. She hesitated, and the closed, sly expression came over her face again. Ruth said softly, What did he tell you, Jane? She took one of the small clenched hands lying on the table and smoothed out the fingers between her own. The little girl slowly turned her eyes to meet those of Ruth, so gentle, so sympathetic. That's the real reason why I wanted to come out. I just had to come out because of what Uncle Joe said. He said, Don't forget, Janie, in the shed under the large flower pot, you'll find the grandest treasure in the world. I thought that today I could go back to the house in Livesey Crescent and find it. It was Charles who spoke. You would like that better than doing anything else? Better than the pantomime, for instance? She was flushed with happy certainty. Oh, yes, please, sir. Charles patted her shoulder. Then that's what we'll do, Jane. Quite soon before it gets dark. And don't call me sir, he added with friendliness. As soon as the clearing away was finished, Charles picked Jane up in his arms, laughingly, and carried her to the car. She sat in front with Charles to direct him. From the heights of the neat suburb in which the Fieldings and their friends lived, they descended the hill which ran almost slap-bang into the double track of tram lines. Small shops, looking tawdry and deserted, with a sort of forlorn after-Christmas appearance, lined both sides of the street. One had glimpses of paper chains, caught strains of music, merriment from upper rooms. 2 little boys sat on a doorstep, blowing up balloons. Ruth mused. It feels like Christmas, the sort of extra Sunday feeling one gets on a full stomach and a contented mind. Perhaps if everyone overate more often, they'd be too well fed to bother about wars and quarrelling with their neighbours. The car turned into a narrow crescent-shaped road. It stopped outside a small semi-detached house, unoccupied, its windows whitewashed and inscribed, disposed of. Jane pointed to an upper window. That's where Uncle died, she whispered with a morbid enjoyment. She jumped out of the car and eagerly pushed open the low iron gate. Ruth tugged Charles back by the arm. She slipped something into his hand. You go to the shed first. I'll keep her back for a few moments, she said hurriedly. He nodded. Her heart melted towards him with a surge of tenderness. Jane was hopping with excitement. This is where I lived, she chanted, and her funny little face was almost beautiful with radiance. Ruth held her back by the hand. It must have been a nice little garden, Jane, when your Uncle Joe was alive, she said gently. Jane pealed with laughter. It was such a lark. Uncle can never grow nothing but marigolds. They were everywhere. Cloth of gold, he used to call them. Oh, but they were ever so pretty, she concluded with a faint wistfulness. Ruth watched Charles as he entered the shed at the end of the small garden. He emerged again almost at once and gave her a smile of confidential, all's well. Dear Charles. She wanted to put her arms round him, feel his mouth against hers, eyes closed, heart beating. Goodness, it must be the wine. Jane ran down the path towards the shed. Without stopping, she went past Charles and through the rickety wooden door. Ruth slipped her arm through Charles. He patted a bulge in his coat pocket. Uncle Joe must have been all kinds of an old devil, he muttered with amusement. Ruth called, "Jane!" The little girl came out of the shed and stood on the garden path, her face awed and pale in the gathering dusk. She held something preciously, carefully, in her open hands. "Oh, oh!" she gasped in rapture. Ruth looked at her own shining necklace of amber. "The greatest treasure in the world," murmured Jane, enraptured. "Wonderful, wonderful," whispered Ruth, and knew the tears were spilling over onto her cheeks. Jane looked at her in understanding, the colour of her eyes deepening. "I know. I always cry when things are beautiful," she said kindly. They spent the evening sitting beside the fire. Jane, resplendent in her amber necklace, her straight hair straggling over her forehead. "Soon I must go back. I bet Matron isn't half wild with me," she sighed. "Would you like to leave the home?" Charles' question was abrupt, sharp to the point of harshness. She shook her head. "Oh no, sir. Oh no," she sounded shocked. "They couldn't do without me. Ever so often I've heard 'em say, 'I don't know what we'd do without Jane.' I've got a way, see, with the kids. When I'm 13, I'll go to the home for bigger girls and train to be something. I'm going to be a nursemaid. I've got a way, see?" Her eyes slid from Charles to Ruth, and a smile flitted across her pale little face. "Maybe when I'm older, you can employ me to look after your babies." "I'd be very good," she said proudly. Charles sucked noisily at his pipe. "We'll remember that," he promised. It was 8:30 when they delivered a sleepy but happy Jane back to the home. "Please don't punish her," pleaded Ruth. "We all love Jane," Matron answered. As they drove home, Ruth leaned her head against Charles's shoulder. "Pull up a moment, will you?" she murmured. He obeyed her at once and slipped his arm round her shoulders. "It's some time since we did any necking in the car," he joked. She snuggled her head beneath his chin, and her hand sought his. "I liked Jane. Plain but appealing," she began. His fingers tightened over hers. "We more or less promised her a job, remember?" For a moment he was silent, and then he went on. "I think she'd make a jolly good nursemaid, don't you? Can't you just imagine her locking our kids in the lavatory if they didn't behave?" Ruth didn't laugh. Neither did Charles. It was one of those moments that came to every married couple when there is much to think about. Hours afterwards, brushing out her hair at the dressing-table mirror, she asked him, "What happened to Uncle Joe's treasure?" He grinned, setting his pillow more comfortably. "It's in the cabinet with the other bottles. What do you think? At 32 and 6 a bottle, it's too precious to chuck away," he said lightly. Well, that's the end of today's story. I hope you enjoyed that. If you would like to find my content anywhere else on the web, I have an Instagram, Facebook, an Etsy shop, a coffee page, Pinterest, and a website. Please remember to like and subscribe and ring the bell so you receive notifications every time a new video comes out. Once again, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.